Hello everybody, welcome to the latest CCAG climate conversation. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Mark Maslin and Azeez Abubakar. Professor Mark Maslin is based at UCL and one of our resident experts, and Azeez is from Nigeria and a youth leader. We're doing things a little bit different today. We're not over Zoom because we're all live here from Sharm el Sheikh. So why don't I start with a simple question. Azeez, from your perspective as a youth leader, what have your thoughts and reflections been so far from this COP process?
So far it's been, very engaging, right? I engaged with a lot of, leaders as well. I've been able to share some messages of young people back home with them, directly with them, so that they can factor that into their negotiation processes. So there's this campaign, it's called the Missing Majority campaign, that's like missing young people who didn't come to COP but had the most affected in the global south. So we've been sharing messages, myself, with other young people, making sure that those voices are heard and those unique stories are told and considered as decision making.
And that probably feels particularly important this year. I'm a veteran, this is only my second, but Mark's been to many more, and I think it's reasonable to say this is perhaps the least open to the youth, so perhaps that project is so important at this time. At this COP, there's been one, I think, particular theme that's run through everything, and that's been loss and damage. And I think as someone who's a youth leader from Nigeria, that is such a critical issue. I'd love to get your thoughts on the broad conversation about loss and damage and where you feel like that is going.
Yeah, so loss and damage over the years in the past hasn't really been of top priority, but at this COP it's been placed in the agenda, right? Because last year we did get some commitments from the Scottish government, but it wasn't as significant as what we would want to have, and then other governments didn't really commit on it as well. So but this year it's now on the agenda, and I'm really hoping that in the future COPs we would have loss and damage be a permanent agenda on COP conversations. So particularly around loss and damage, I've seen a whole lot of conversation happen. I also contribute to this campaign called Loss and Damage Finance Now, and we're working with the Climate Clock, working with a coalition of loss and damage youth, and a collaboration of loss and damage researchers. So we did a research on cost of delay. So this simply means that while we're waiting, while we're not acting on loss and damage, there is also a cost being added to the overall cost of loss and damage. So which is what we're trying to amplify at COP as well, and some of the discussions we've been having.
Brilliant. Yeah. Mark, perhaps I can come to you and ask for just initial broad thoughts and reflections.
So this COP's very strange. It's really quiet. There's lots of engagement, indigenous people, youth groups are really engaged, but it's really quiet. I mean, I can walk comfortably down between the pavilions, whereas in Glasgow it was a rugby scrum, just to get from A to B. And there isn't that energy. And I think that's partly because of the hosts haven't really understood how you run negotiations at the international level. But I also think it's problematic with the timing. So we've had the US midterm elections, which basically was everybody's focus for week one. Week two, we had the G20. So all the leaders that we want to be here, and I have to say respect to President Lula, he made it here, so thank him for that, because great announcements from Brazil on deforestation and reducing it, absolutely brilliant. But we also then, even if it goes into the weekend with the loss and damage analysis and discussions, we start the World Cup. So the whole world and the media aren't looking. So there's not that pressure. So there's pressure from inside. Incredible youth leaders like you are pushing, but there isn't that outside focus that there was at Glasgow. So what we can hope for is that there's no watering down of the Glasgow Climate Pact. We can hope that there is progress with loss and damage, so we move to the next stage, and therefore it perhaps sets up for the next couple of COPs. Now it's really interesting. The next COP will be in the UEA, will be right in the heart of the Middle East, in oil country, so that will be a really interesting piece of politics. But after that, it looks like it's going to Eastern Europe, and then it will go to the Americas, hopefully somewhere in South America. So lots to play for to make sure we don't slide back from where we made the small steps forward in Glasgow.
Totally. And Azeez, if I come back to you, do you have, from your various conversations, I'm sure you've had lots, what are the things that you're perhaps worried most about, and perhaps some of the things that you're more optimistic about from the conversations and the things that we're seeing here?
Okay, so let me start with things I'm most optimistic about.
Okay.
Yeah. So
let's stay positive.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm kind of hopeful that things like loss and damage, climate adaptation and resilience would remain very key, and I'm kind of hopeful that we'll see a lot of actual implementation happen right after this. Because every time we come for this COP, because I was in Glasgow, and every time we come for this COP, we say, oh, we're going to implement this, and then at the end of the day, not so much, right? I'm hopeful that there will be more accountability with the right key stakeholders being involved, like the private sector, like accountability across all levels. I'm just kind of hopeful that would happen. I am a bit worried about the nature of how it's being done. I asked my question, does this really work? Does the framework really work?
We all ask ourselves that question.
We keep repeating the same things we've been saying for decades now, but where are we really going? We keep talking about 1.5 degree Celsius, we keep talking about limiting emissions, we keep making these big commitments, 200 billion for developing countries, but yet most of these commitments are not being met, right? So I'm like, okay, what are we really doing then? And then I kind of think that having a very legally binding framework that really, really works in ensuring that countries don't just jump out of the Paris Agreement, for instance, or just making sure that all sides are being fulfilled in terms of making sure that developing and least developed countries get the needed support and resources to help them adapt to the climate crisis. It can only be fair when we make sure that really works with the framework. Like the UNFCCC framework needs to really ensure that it's very fair, especially for developing and least developed countries to get that needed support to adapt and build resilience. While it's important to mitigate climate crisis, I feel like lots more needs to be done around loss and damage, adaptation and resilience.
I think that's really interesting. It reminds me of something we talk about a lot at CCAG, which is trust. And a lot of these things feel like there's maybe not a trust gap and a bit of a trust chasm that's starting to form. Mark, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, the problem is that we're looking at 500 years of history, okay? And I think people do not remember that. We're looking at colonial powers that have come into countries, taken their resources, taken their people, moved them to different continents, and basically used that to develop, become very rich. And the thing is, they've forgotten that. They're here at the negotiations, they forget that. But Nigerians, Indians, Chinese, they haven't forgotten that history. And therefore, if we're actually going to build a global community, we need to think about how do we undo that damage? How do we support people? And for me, I think one of the most important things is we forget we're still in a humanitarian crisis now. 7 million children die needlessly every year of preventable diseases and hunger. 825 million people go to bed feeling hungry. 1 billion people still do not have regular access to safe drinking water. So we need to lift those out of extreme poverty at the same time that we deal with climate change and all the other environmental issues. But we can't do that without the lens of history. We need to actually take account, be accountable, and actually say, well, loss and damage is a very small amount of money to actually build trust and actually undo just a little bit of the damage that's been done by colonial powers over the last 450 years.
Yeah, very, very valid points you mentioned there. We also need to change perspectives and narrative, right? because sometimes when the global north give to the global south, it seems like charity, and I don't think that should really be, like, it shouldn't be seen like that. And also I feel like climate finance needs to come in terms of grants, more in terms of grants and less of loans, because we've seen what loans have done for developing, like it keeps in the cycle of debt, and we don't want that, right? So we need to really change narratives, perspectives, making sure that we build that trust between the global north and the global south.
That piece on narratives feels so prescient at the moment. I think it can at times feel like we've been pushing the same narrative for a long time, and I think one of the things I love about being at these COPs and any big events is we feel like a community, and I think it's so important that we find that narrative that pulls the community together and not apart, because sometimes it can feel like that.
I think that's one thing I try to communicate, because so many people, I'm sure you get the same, go, why are you going to COP? What's the use of COP? But actually, by just trying to show people what happens in the pavilions, the conversations between youth leaders and presidents, between the World Bank and sort of the IOA, sort of like those conversations are so powerful. And this is the only place that I know that all countries of the UN have the same voice, are all present. Okay, they have different sized delegations, okay? We've seen some of the delegations, and sort of like St. Kitts basically brings one or two people, but they have the same voice. This is unique. This is not the G20. This is where everybody has an equal footing, and it is also where we can get youth leaders, indigenous people, native peoples, all coming and actually giving their view and also their opinions, which is really important.
Such good insight, and I think that I like that positivity, and I think I want to end this conversation on a positive note, and with no preparation. Sorry guys, I want you to think of, I'm conscious that most people watching this won't have ever been to a COP, won't have had this exposure, so I'm going to ask you this: what's the most insightful thing that you've seen or heard this week, or the thing that you're going to take away with you that leaves you feeling positive about this? And I'll give you a second, because I'll start with mine so you can think. I think mine has been, this has been badged as the first African COP, and I don't think it's fit that brief, but what I have loved is some of the conversations I've heard from African leadership and from the voices of Africa. So often Africa's seen as a homogenous group, and actually hearing conversations about the real issues in singular African countries and the actual ways we can fix them and the positive ways forward has left me feeling really positive about Africa. And I heard somebody say that this continent holds the keys for the future of the world. And I hope that everybody leaves feeling that, and feeling that the talent and the knowledge and the tools are here in this continent for success. So that's my insight. Mark, what do you think?
So my insight is that when you have positive, dynamic leaders, things can change. So the whole atmosphere when President Lula turned up here, I mean, heroes welcome. He has single-handed saved the rainforest. He hasn't. But it is a shift in politics in Brazil. It means that we all know that we have someone that we can work with to actually try to preserve the rainforest, slow down deforestation. So that's the positivity. If you have people like that, and for me, what's interesting is when we have all these amazing youth leaders from all around the world here. These are the future leaders. These are the future politicians. These are the people who are going to be the Lulas. They are going to be the people that look back and go, Trump? Really? No. Guess what? I'm looking after my country, I'm looking after all my people, and I'm going to look after the planet too. So that's the bit I take away.
Thanks. And Azeez, what about you?
Okay, so for me, I feel like this is just a stepping stone. Like it's a step, and that's would definitely see some very real action coming out of, from the African continent. It's already been happening, but I feel like it's like a key it's a pivotal time for like African people to just key into and also like showcase some of the real impact they're making.
Mark, Azeez, thank you so much, and thank you everybody.
Thank you, Zack.